The next speaker doesn't really need too much introduction, Jim Sillars. Said right at the very beginning that apart from trying to win this yes vote, we've really opened up a debate about the nature of future independent Scotland. Jim has made a major contribution to that debate in the book he's written, In Place of Fear, the Socialist Programme for an Independent Scotland, copies of which are over there. So without further ado, Jim.
Thank you. I'm actually always surprised when Mayor than Me turns up to this meeting. And I'll tell you why. Do you remember the stairhead fight between Nicola and Joanne Lamont on STV? Well, during that Rammy, she said something that a lot of folk missed. This is what Joanne said. We're not genetically programmed in Scotland to make political decisions. That means we're thick. There cannot be any other meaning that you can, Joanne, of course, used much more flamboyant language than you're thick. Now, suppose Alex Salmond had said that about the English, or the Welsh, or the Irish, or the French, there would be a clamour for him to apologise. Why has there been no clamour demanding that Joanne Lamont apologise for the insult she laid upon the Scottish nation? Because in this referendum campaign, you can say anything you like about us and get away with it. They say at the beginning of any big debate, of course I recognise that Scotland can be a viable economic and political entity. Then as you go through policy after policy after policy, they tell us every one will be a disaster. And it could only be a disaster if Joanne is right, that we're no genetically programmed to make political decisions in this country of ours. But of course, they're in for a big surprise. Surprise, surprise. We're just as intelligent as the folk educated at Eton and Oxford. Just, as a matter of fact, I believe on occasion we are more intelligent and can prove it than some of these folk. I remember going down in 1979, along with John Smith, Margot MacDonald, myself, to debate at the Oxford Union. And after the debate, I happened to be walking out with the president of the Oxford Union. And I said to him, where do I pick up my PhD? And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, my PhD, where do I get it? Is it waiting out at the side of the door? I don't understand, he said. I said, listen, if you're the creme de la creme in there, compared to me, pal, I've got a PhD waiting at the door. One of the great tragedies of the Scottish working class is that we've believed what they've told us. We've believed we're inadequate. We've been in a great prison of the myth of our own inadequacy. When they say you're too wee, you're too poor, you've got to hold the hand of big cousin England, they are telling you you're not up to the mark in terms of running your own country the way other people do. That's why in the video introduction to last Friday's ceremony for Margot, one of the things she said was, she was talking to Scottish people, be better than you think you are. And the reason she said that is for generations, we've been taught to think that we're not as good as we actually can be. We've been trapped in this myth of our own inadequacy. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this campaign is convince the Scottish working class of their talent and their ability. And say, go and look in the mirror and compare yourself with the people we have allowed to rule this country generation after generation. If we were in charge, would there be 250,000 children in Scotland living in poverty? Would there be 50,000 families over in the city of Edinburgh living below the poverty line if we were in charge of our country? We've got better standards, we've got better values, and we've got a better intelligence than the folk that we've allowed to run our country for generations. That's what we've fundamentally got to understand that this referendum is about. It's about the liberation of the Scottish working class. Now, how do we tackle our problems? They're telling us in the big billboards, the best of two worlds. Devolution, you'll get more power, and you've got the big, powerful United Kingdom's arms wrapped around you. That's what the billboards are saying. More power for the Scottish Parliament. We'll get, at the most, according to the present promises, 40% control of the Scottish budget. That means 60% is controlled from Westminster. Hardly worth bothering about, because we'll be constrained all the time. And then this great, big, powerful, rich UK that we're supposed to remain with, it isn't big, it isn't rich, it isn't powerful any longer. We're at the end of the English Empire. All empires decline. Persian Empire, Alexander the Great's, Rome, Portugal, Spain, and then the English one. It's in decline, and it's in the last stages of decline. The United Kingdom is heading for £1.5 trillion worth of debt. In order to keep going at the present time, the Chancellor has to borrow £100 billion this year. Skint, that's what they are. If you want proof, when I joined the Royal Navy in mid-1950s, there was a home fleet, a Mediterranean fleet, a Far East fleet, and the West Indies station. Why did the Queen in her Jubilee sail up the Clyde or the Thames in a wee boat with the Duke of Edinburgh and the full Admiral of the Fleet gear? Why? Because in the past, when the monarch had a Jubilee, the monarch reviewed the fleet. There's nae fleet to review now. Sign of decline. There's aircraft carrier being built in the Clyde and Rosyth, which will have no aircraft on board. And when they finally do get the aircraft on board in 2018, according to last week's testimony in the United States Congress, those aircraft will be able to fly on and fly off, but there's one thing they can't do, they actually can't fire their weapons, because they don't have enough money for the kind of software required for them to do that. Now, these are just indications, serious indications of the decline that's going on in this British state called the United Kingdom. And we're being asked to accept that as part of the best of both worlds. It's a nonsense. The alternative is independence. And as Colin says, what do we do with it? I'm no voting yes on the 18th just to say, well, that's it, job done. That's only the start of the job. It's what we do from the 19th of September on that I'm really concerned about. And if we are going to turn our country from one which is high unemployment, low wages, and a lot of poverty, we have to have a programme that will do it. And that's why I wrote that book, In Place of Fear 2, a socialist programme for an independent Scotland. And there's two reasons for that title. First of all, In Place of Fear 1 was written by an Iron Bevan, one of my great heroes. And an Iron Bevan said this, that the greatest armament of a socialist is to be audacious. Have the audacity to think the way the establishment don't want you to think, and have the audacity to do what the establishment told you you cannot do. We tend to take the National Health Service for granted now. It wasn't taken for granted after 1945. And Iron Bevan had to fight every vested interest in the establishment, the political and the medical establishment, to get the National Health Service founded. We've got to have the same attitude when we come to an independent Scotland and the programme that we want to produce. It's a question of what do we do with the resources? And the greatest resource we have is our children. By the way, this referendum campaign isn't about Alex Salmond. Alex Salmond's mortal, the nation's immortal. I'm no fighting this for a victory for Alex Salmond, because it'll no be a victory for Alex Salmond. The people who will finally decide yes or no are the working class people, most of them who normally vote Labour. So it won't be an SNP victory. And we've got to forget and put that aside. It's what we can do when we get the victory on the 19th of September. And we'll start with education. At the moment, we've got 32 local education authorities in Scotland. 50% of the money we allocate to education never gets near the schools. It's absorbed by the bureaucracy. So without spending one extra penny, we can increase the financial resources going to each school. You just knock down from 32 to 5 education authorities in Scotland, and you transfer immediately over £500 million extra into the schools. But we can do more than that. How many folk in here are aware that all the independent, or what I call private schools, get 80% reduction in their council tax? Many folk knew that. Right, well they do. In Edinburgh, Fettes, whose council tax liability is £209,000, pays £41,000. At the other end of that city of Edinburgh, in a deprived area called Wester Hailes, the liability is £261,000, and that school pays £261,000. There you are, for Fettes, where it's about 25,000 to get there. A huge reduction from 209,000 down to 41,000, and the schools at the other end, where most of the Wains are in free school meals because the families are poor, pay the full whack. So what do you do about that if you're a socialist? You look at the legislation, and the test in the legislation, because the private schools claim they are doing charitable things, public good. That's the test, public good. And the reason the state schools don't get that reduction is because the minister pays for education, public education. If you're a socialist and you're audacious, with one sweep of the legislative pen, you change that. And that school gets 80% reduction, the same as everybody else. No problem whatsoever. But just think of the difference it would make to every state school in Scotland, on top of the money allocated from the reduction in education authorities. You had the reduction, they were only paying 20% council tax instead of 80% council tax. We're talking about the transformation of our educational system as it applies to our young people. Then there's the question of jobs for adults. How do we create it? There's 157,000 families on the housing waiting list in our country at the moment. How do you solve that? Well, you can only solve it by building houses. There isn't any other way. It's no magic. You build houses, folk get them, and they're off the waiting list. If we were building 25 to 30,000 new houses a year, Folk have got to find work to quarry the sand. Somebody's got to work to make the cement. Somebody's got to work to manufacture the bricks. Somebody's got to work to transport them, all the gear, to the site. And folk have got to put them together, and plumbers and slaters and joiners have got to complete it so that folk can move in. Right along that line, you've created real jobs and real apprenticeships. Then the other side will say, but how do you pay for it? This is socialist pie in the sky. Well, again, you have to be audacious. You have to look at a thing called the Private Finance Initiative, which you and me are going to pay something like 22 billion quid to the ones that have built the hospitals and the schools under PFI over the next 30 years. Bring them in. Tell them the good days are over. We're not having it any longer. We want to renegotiate the contracts. Now, contracts are renegotiated in the commercial world every day in the week. There's nothing unusual about it. They're going to say no. And so we'd have to say to them, well, that's hard luck, because we've got the power. The working class control the new Scottish Parliament. We've got the lawyers and we've got the legislative power, and we're taking 30 to 40% off what we pay you, and we'll just call it a profits tax. And you use that money to build the houses, to create jobs. That's what you can do. It's not rocket science, it's the application of socialist willpower. Then I want to tell you about the thing that Scots get very uncomfortable about. It's the oil. We have been in a prison of lies on the oil ever since the first drop landed on the mainland. It wouldn't last long, it'll go away, it's volatile. In fact, Janie Buchan, who came from Glasgow, was an MEP for the Labour Party, on television one night said it couldn't be Scotland's oil because we didn't put it there. Margot reminded me that actually during a debate with Harry Selby down in the Pearce Institute, he said the same thing. I used to work in the Arab world, and I would tell my Arab friends, and they would say, we didn't put it there either, but by James, look what we've done with it. Most of the debate on oil has been about how much of the tax revenues we should have got and will get in the future. I want you to think outside that box. Think of what you can actually do with the black stuff itself. Because the amount of oil in the North Sea is worth more to 5 million people in an independent Scotland than it is to 60 million people inside the United Kingdom. That's a concept that the Scots haven't thought about and grasped yet. But that means that we can do more with that oil than if we were part of the UK. Just think, if we took actually a relatively small proportion of that black stuff, and when it was refined through Grangemouth, we reduced the price of petrol, diesel, and jet fuel for aircraft. Think of the consequences. First of all, you put more money into folks' pockets and they spend locally. Secondly, you make the Scottish transport industry, with all the trucks and everything else, including the trains and all that, you make them much cheaper to run and therefore much more competitive in terms internationally in Europe. And for the tourist trade, a lot of our tourism comes from the northeast of England. Man, wife, two wains, into the car, up over the border. Not many of them go further than the Glasgow-Edinburgh line because of the cost of going up into the Highlands. Reduce their costs on fuel and you start to give a huge boost to the tourist industry and therefore more jobs as well. And if you reduce jet fuel costs from a base in Scotland, it gives Glasgow and Edinburgh airports a better chance to attract airlines on the direct services that our economy needs to other parts of the world. We can do that with that substance when we own it. The great problem we have in Scotland is that we don't know very much about the oil industry. I was belaboured at one meeting in Edinburgh for not advocating the nationalisation of the North Sea. And I had to explain to the guy, one of the reasons I don't advocate it is we don't have the human capacity, we couldn't run it if we nationalised it the morning. And he said, that's not true. Think of all the workers that work in the North Sea and the rigs. And I said, that's right. And what do they do when they come after the rigs? They disperse all over the country. Whereas in the days of shipbuilding, mining and steel, these were communities where men and women met in the same pubs and the same clubs and the same discussion, and a knowledge of their industry grew. We don't have that. There's no great conglomeration of the oil workers when they come onto the mainland. That's why I've advocated in that book that we create a Scottish National Oil Corporation, so that we start to own some of that oil and start to learn about how that North Sea is supposedly managed on our behalf. One of the strange things that's happening, there's something like 350 rigs in the North Sea. A lot of them are becoming technologically redundant and they'll have to be decommissioned. The Scottish Parliament Committee was told yesterday by an expert, that'll cost Scotland, that'll cost us 45 billion quid. I don't get this. I can't get my head round this. They took the oil, bypassed us, but we've to pay for the decommissioning. Not on. And if we have a socialist government, they'll pay for the decommissioning and we'll get the decommissioning work here. There's going to be something like £10.3 billion worth of decommissioning over the next 10 years. If we don't have an independent government, we'll get none of it. It'll go elsewhere. If we have an independent government, we control the North Sea and we'll tell them it happens here. And that means the creation of jobs, not just semi-skilled and unskilled. It involves the creation of scientific and highly skilled jobs when you're dealing with the decommissioning of an oil rig. The other thing is, that they forget to tell us, there's oil in the Clyde, oil and gas in the Clyde. Why have we not been told about it? Because if you put oil rigs along the Firth of Clyde, Trident cannot sail safely by the Ailsa of Craig. But nae Trident, then we can have the development just off our shores in the Firth of Clyde, and think of the stimulus that would make to the Glasgow, Gourock and North Ayrshire economies. That's all possible when we've got the power of independence. It won't happen if we vote no. We'll keep the way we are at the present time, being kept in the dark and kept in ignorance about that tremendous, tremendous resource that we have. One of the things I'm trying to do, the chairman says I'm an old man, it's true, I'm 76. Margot always said, when someone says that, I explain to them that she married a much older man. And I mean, why am I going round the country at my age? I should be sitting watching Bayern Munich tonight. It's because I'm a member of the Scottish working class. And I went into politics to liberate the Scottish working class from the fear and anxiety that has been our lot ever since my great-grandpa was born. The insecurity and the anxiety about whether or not you're going to have work and you'll be able to keep your family in the way you want. The working class have got to remember something that's fundamental. If we can't sell our labour, we're in a fix. We're unemployed. We're at the behest of the state. And if it doesn't like you, it can make you destitute, as people are being made destitute today. So, control of the economy on behalf of the working class to ensure that we can sell our labour, that our bargaining power is better than an employer's. And that bargaining power gives us the opportunity to have the kind of skilled jobs and the wages that make our lives and make our children's and grandchildren's lives much better than it ever was for my father and my grandfather. Incidentally, there's a fair number of middle-class folk learning that lesson as well. We've got accountants and lawyers today who are either on part-time or they're unemployed, suddenly discovering that what was applicable to the working class for generations is applicable to them as well. So my whole purpose in this campaign is to tell working class people that you are talented, you have ability, and that this referendum is about power. That's what this referendum is about. Whether you will take power or whether you will give power away. With power for the working class people, we can not just win the referendum, we can win a parliament that we control, that produces our policies. There's an old miner in Netherthird in Cumnock way back in 1979, whose words went right into my mind at that meeting and never left them, and I've recorded them in a book. In Netherthird and Cumnock, they don't ask questions, they make speeches. And he ended his speech by saying, the great problem in Scotland is that all our socialist dreams have been destroyed by the London connection. And it's absolutely true. You had Miliband up here telling us one Christmas to a Labour government. Well, I remember standing for a re-election in 1992 in Penilee and Govan in a big crowded meeting where the Labour candidate got up and I had explained about the coming powers of Asia, who said you don't need to listen to Jim, all we need is a Labour government, to wild applause. The magic pill. That's what Miliband was selling last week as well. Forget all this argument about independence, a Labour government's coming. How many folk in here read the Daily Telegraph? You and me and Colin.
I was lying.
I read it because I want to ken what the Tory party in England are thinking. It's quite important. I was always brought up as a trade union official not just to look at my end of the telescope, but look at the other end as well. About a month ago, and you maybe remember this, Miliband had an article in the Daily Telegraph. And obviously they took the gamble knowing that in Penilee only one person would read it. And what that article said was that Miliband's great concern was with Middle England. They were the ones that were really getting screwed by the government. And if he became the Prime Minister in a Labour government, then Middle England was his priority. He didn't tell us that up here. Now, I understand the problem. If they want to get elected south of the border, the Labour Party have to pander to Middle England. And if they get in on Middle England's votes, then they've got to produce the policies that Middle England want, not the policies that you and I want. So, even if there's a Labour government, you're going to get a different government from the one that he was talking about up here. And I remember that 1992 meeting when the audience applauded the Labour candidate who said we need a Labour government. We didn't get one. And right now there's only 1% between the Tories and the Labour Party in the polls. And unless the opposition's 10, 12, 15% ahead at this time in the electoral cycle, they can't win the general election in 12 months' time. So let's put aside the anxieties of Mr. Miliband, who wants to be Prime Minister. Think of us here. This is about my grandchildren. It's about your grandchildren. And it's about the children yet unborn. If we vote no, it's a low wage, very low ambition, very poorly paid economy for the people who live in it. I'm a grandpa, I've got 10 grandchildren, and when every one of them reached primary 7, starting to go into S1, I've always written a grandpa letter of advice. And actually, believe it or no, they listen. And my advice has been that if we remain part of the United Kingdom, they will have to get the best qualifications they possibly can in order to escape to Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, in order to have a decent life with some personal ambition that can be fulfilled. I don't want that to happen, but that's the advice I feel compelled to give them. I don't want them to go to university or college or get a skilled apprenticeship and then find there's nothing here for them and ambition is killed because Scottish horizons are so low. That's what it's all about. Nothing to do with Alex Salmond. Elaine C. Smith put it very well the other night in a meeting in Edinburgh when she said, suppose down the line we've voted no and a grandchild says to Granny, what did you do in the referendum, Granny? I voted no. Why did you vote no? I didn't like the man leading the Scottish government at that time. Who was it? Oh, I can't remember. That's the stupidity of believing that this is about Alex Salmond and the SNP. They take credit for the fact they've brought us to the point where we can make a decision. But it's not about them, it's about you, me, and the grandchildren. Now, on the 18th of September, for the first time in our working class history, we are sovereign. Nobody can prevent us doing what we want in the hours, the 15 hours, between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. This nation is in our hands. We decide, and the working class are in the majority in this nation of Scotland. What happens at 1 minute past 10 p.m? Have we kept that sovereignty? Have we kept the power inherent in that sovereignty and can use it for what we want? Or have we given it away again, once more, to another nation south of the border where we'll always be in a minority relationship? That's the real choice. And every single one of us is on the spot between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. It's our responsibility. Can't blame the neighbour, can't he blame the wife, can't he blame the partner. It's us, individually and then collectively, who will make that decision. And I tell the Scottish working class this, Scottish politics will be turned upside down with a yes vote. Colin's right. This, in fact, surpasses the poll tax because it surpasses the poll tax in its importance. This is the greatest grassroots movement this country has ever seen. There are thousands of people from all parties and no parties, including the Labour Party, who are working for a yes vote. And those of us like myself and Colin are working for a yes vote, so that at 1 minute past 10, we, the working class majority, can say without fear of anybody else, our time has finally come.